In the early Middle Ages, salt decided whether food lasted or failed. Meat, fish, and even some dairy needed it to survive the long gap between harvests. Winter tested every household, and so did the church calendar, when fast days pushed people towards stored foods instead of fresh meat. Without salt, a good slaughter turned into waste within days, so access to it was not a comfort, it was survival, measured in meals. But salt did not appear everywhere. Some communities lived near the sea, others near inland springs, where salty water rose from the ground, and many lived far from either. That distance changed daily life. If a village could reach a brine spring or a tidal flat, people returned again and again, learning the same hard routine. Gathering brine, heating it, and letting water leave while crystals remained. The work repeated because hunger repeated. Over time, that repetition became organized. Instead of boiling brine only in emergencies, people began doing it on schedule, building simple pans and setting aside labor for the task. Along coasts, shallow basins helped sun and wind do part of the job. Inland, fires did the heavy lifting. Small, local salt-making turned a fragile supply into something steadier. It stayed a basic craft, but it changed everything. It made preservation predictable. Demand rose, and salt stopped looking like a simple craft. It started looking like a power source. Rulers noticed that the same spring, the same shoreline pan, could feed whole districts and set prices far beyond the village. So claims appeared. A king's officer, a count, a bishop, an abbot, each reached for the same lever, legal rights over where salt came from and who touched it. Monasteries played a central role. They held land, they organized labor, and they treated salt as income that lasted year after year. Rights got written down in charters that spelled out privileges and limits. Who could boil brine? Who could scrape pans? How many days a household owed at the works? Even when the salt was not taken directly, rent and dues followed it like a shadow. Regulation followed ownership. Authorities tried to prevent weak brine, watered salt, and short measures that cheated buyers and lowered revenue. They set rules for when boiling happened, how output got counted, and where selling was allowed. The goal sounded practical: steady supply, predictable quality, but the outcome was political. Salt turned into a formal badge of authority and a dependable stream of rent. Salt no longer stayed close to where it was made. It moved. Loads left coastal pans and inland springs, then followed the easiest paths people already trusted. Rivers that carried barges, ports that gathered cargo, and mountain passes that opened for a few safe months. Each link connected another inland town to a source it could not reach on its own. Distance did not just widen the market, it changed the stakes. Moving salt demanded planning, and a new kind of trader stepped in to do it. Specialized merchants tracked when roads held, which ferries ran, and which harbors had space to store a shipment. They built routines with carters, boatmen, and innkeepers, creating market networks that outlasted any single trip. Salt started to behave like a true trade good. It could be redirected, withheld, and sent where profit looked safest. And the price stopped reflecting only how rare salt seemed at the source. It rose or fell with the journey. Every toll gate, bridge fee, port charge and border duty added a layer, and every delay meant extra hands to pay and extra risk to cover. A town might sat beside full granaries yet paid more for salt simply because the route cost more. Salt became expensive for reasons people could not taste. As towns grew busier, salt stopped moving hand to hand on trust alone. Buyers wanted to know what they paid for, and officials wanted to know what they could charge. So towns set Common measures, how much a scoop meant, what a weight counted as, how a sack had to be filled. This sounded simple. It changed everything. Once salt came in standard units, it became legible, comparable, and taxable. With standards in place, towns enforced them. Market rules set when salt could be sold, where it could be displayed, and what counts as fair dealing. Inspectors checked weights and measures, and dishonest ones faced fines or confiscation. The goal was not just honesty, it was control. If salt arrived in a defined measure, a fee could be attached to it every time it crossed a stall, a gate, or a scale. Civic oversight tightened further. City councils appointed officials to supervise trade, and merchant groups and craft-like associations pushed to limit who could sell and under what rules. Licenses, approved stalls, and required measures narrowed the field. Some sellers gained protection and predictability. Others got squeezed out. The outcome was clear. Salt trade became a managed system, and the town, not the individual, set the terms of exchange. As rulers gained firmer control, they looked for income they could count on. Salt offered that. It entered towns and crossed bridges every day in loads that could be measured and charged. So duties appeared at gates, river landings, and mountain passes. Each payment seemed small, but it happened again and again. Salt stopped being only a traded good. It became a moving tax base. These charges did not stay improvised for long. Officials recorded amounts, set rates, and punished evasion, because steady revenue mattered more than occasional windfalls. Salt money helped pay for courts that enforced rulings, clerks who kept accounts, and guards who controlled crossings. It also helped raise walls and repair fortifications. When rulers prepared campaigns, they leaned on the same dependable stream. Budgets hardened around salt. But the bill did not land on the treasury alone. It travelled straight into the price of food. When transit fees stacked up, merchants raised their prices, and households felt it in every salted meal, every preserved fish, every piece of cured meat meant to last. The tax acted like a quiet multiplier, touching rich and poor, town and village. A basic seasoning now carried the weight of government. Salt making stopped looking like a seasonal craft and started looking like a permanent workplace. Producers expanded evaporation fields and built more boiling capacity because the old pace no longer met demand. That scale required fuel, tools, repairs, and steady supervision. So investment gathered where salt could be made in bulk. Workers followed. Small sites still existed, but major centres now pulled people in and set the tempo. In some places, producers went deeper, tapping brine below the surface and lifting it out in large volumes. That changed the problem. Now the challenge was not finding salt water, but moving it, heating it, and concentrating it day after day. More hands were needed for pumping, hauling, stoking, and scraping. Schedules tightened. Output rose sharply, and with it came a new kind of discipline built around continuous production. This was proto-industry, not factories in the modern sense, but organized production that ran on coordinated labor and heavy costs. The benefits looked obvious. More salt meant more preserved food and more trade, but the risk grew just as fast. Whole communities leaned on one resource, one employer, one chain of supply. If brine failed, fuel ran short, or access was cut. The shock hit everyone at once. As the big salt centres grew, control of them stopped being a local question and turned into high politics. A ruler who held the pans, the brine wells, and the boiling houses held cash. Rivals understood that. They watched the same places that fed towns and paid officials, and they planned around them. Saltworks began to sit on lists of targets, right beside bridges and forts. The fight rarely started with a grand battle. It started with interruption. A road that carried salt could be blocked. A river toll point could be seized. A warehouse could be raided at night, not for glory, but for inventory. Every cart that failed to arrive meant fewer coins in the treasury and fewer barrels of preserved food in storage. Cutting salt flow became a quiet way to weaken an enemy. Then the pressure tightened into sieges. Instead of storming walls, armies aimed at the logic of supply. If a town depended on a salt route, attackers tried to choke it and wait. Hunger came faster when meat could not be cured, and panic rose when prices jumped. Defenders spent resources to protect pans, escort convoys, and rebuild stores. Salt no longer followed war. Salt caused it. After fighting over saltworks and routes, governments tightened their grip. They treated salt less like a traded good and more like a managed necessity. Monopolies hardened, licenses narrowed. Official depots and approved sellers mattered as much as the salt itself. Rules fixed where it went, who handled it, and what it cost. The intention sounded simple: stop disruption, protect revenue, prevent shortages. The result felt different on the ground. Price and distribution controls reached into everyday life. Town councils clashed with royal agents over who set measures and who collected the money. Producers faced quotas and inspections that punished side sales. Merchants saw routes redirected towards state stores instead of open markets. And buyers met the new system at the only point that really mattered to them: the counter. When salt cost more, or appeared only at official times and places, people blamed the hand behind it. Resentment spread because the pressure landed on everyone, not just traders and officials. Salt was not optional, and the state's markup felt like a tax on survival. So people bent the rules. Smuggling grew along back roads, river landings, and border villages where jurisdictions overlapped. Hidden sacks undercut the official price and embarrassed authorities. Governments answered with searches, seizures, and harsher penalties. Salt policy stopped being paperwork and became a daily contest between power and necessity. By the late Middle Ages, salt no longer moved only through local habits and old promises. Trade expanded, towns grew, and rulers needed income they could count on. That pressure pushed salt into a wider fiscal machine. Rights that once sat with a monastery, a lord, or a town council started getting folded into bigger plans. Salt became paperwork. It had to be measured, recorded, and turned into revenue that could be forecast. Control shifted through contracts and leases. Instead of running every boiling house directly, governments granted the work to operators who paid for the privilege and delivered fixed sums on schedule. The system favoured people who could raise cash, hire labour, and move bulk loads. Officials tracked output, checked accounts, and enforced rules across whole regions. Supply stopped being a series of small bargains. It became an administered pipeline, built to feed treasuries as much as households. That change altered the balance of power. Local exemptions and special rights still existed, but they mattered less when central offices set terms and expected payment regardless of local hardship. Salt policy started looking like other state income, gathered routinely and defended aggressively. Smuggling remained, but now it challenged a system, not just a neighbour. In the end, salt stood as an economic instrument managed from above, designed to make the state more predictable and more capable. In the modern world, salt stopped behaving like a strategic prize and started behaving like a product. Industrial production scaled what medieval boilers and pans once managed by hand. Mines cut deep into rock salt, pumps drew brine in steady streams, and factories refined it with speed and consistency. Costs fell. Output rose, and once salt moved in bulk, by rail, by ship, by truck, distance stopped acting like a wall. Global trade then finished the job. A bad harvest year or a local shortage no longer forced whole regions into higher prices, hunger or desperation. Salt came from somewhere else. Ports, wholesalers and supermarkets replaced guarded storehouses and toll stations. Governments still regulated salt for purity and health, but they no longer leaned on it as a main tax engine. Revenue shifted to other systems and salt lost its political leverage. That change rewrote what salt meant. In the early medieval world, a steady supply decided whether meat lasted, whether fish reached inland, whether armies stayed fed, and whether rulers filled their treasuries. Scarcity had once created power. Now abundance dissolved it. Salt still mattered, but mostly quietly. Seasoning food, curing it by choice, feeding industries that used it as an input. The mineral that once shaped sovereignty ended as an ordinary commodity.